5 minutes ago, Princess Catherine broke 2 decades of silence and shattered the carefully constructed fairy tale, telling her closest confidants the devastating truth about her marriage to Prince William. And now those revelations are tearing Kensington Palace apart from the inside. What she disclosed wasn't about affairs or scandals, but something far more damaging: the suffocating loneliness of a marriage where duty has slowly strangled intimacy, where the future king treats her more like a royal employee than a wife, and where she's spent years performing happiness while dying inside. The palace is in absolute chaos, trying to contain the fallout, because if Catherine's truth reaches the public, it won't just destroy William's reputation, it could bring down the entire facade of the modern monarchy. The confession. It began with a single conversation in the afternoon, an unguarded moment when Catherine's carefully maintained composure finally cracked after 20 years of holding everything together. She was sitting in her private study at Adelaide Cottage, the winter light filtering through the windows, when her most trusted lady-in-waiting, Sophie Alderton, noticed that something was profoundly wrong. Catherine's hands were trembling as she held a cup of tea, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Her usual perfect posture collapsed into something resembling defeat. Sophie had worked for Catherine for 8 years, had witnessed countless private moments, and had become as close to a true friend as royal protocol permitted. But she had never seen the princess like this, had never heard the raw pain in Catherine's voice when she finally began to speak about truths she had buried for so long that even she had started to believe the performance. "I can't do this anymore," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep pretending that everything is fine, that my marriage is some grand love story, that I'm not slowly disappearing inside a role that was never meant for someone like me." The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. Catherine spoke about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, about feeling like a beautiful accessory in William's life, rather than a true partner. She described how their relationship had transformed over the years, from genuine connection to something cold and transactional, where conversations revolved entirely around schedules and duties and public perception, rather than dreams or fears or any of the intimacy that should exist between husband and wife. She talked about how William had changed after becoming Prince of Wales, how the weight of his future responsibilities had made him increasingly distant and controlling. He treated her with courtesy, sometimes even affection in public, but in private, there was an emotional absence that left her feeling more alone than if she had been actually solitary. He consulted her about the children's schedules, but never about his own thoughts or struggles. He performed the role of devoted husband for cameras, but retreated into himself the moment they were behind closed doors. Catherine spoke about the suffocating nature of palace life, how every decision was made by committee, how her own preferences and desires were constantly overruled by considerations of protocol and image. She had entered this world as a confident young woman with her own identity and ambitions, but over 20 years, she had been slowly erased, replaced by a perfectly styled and scripted version of herself that bore less and less resemblance to who she actually was or wanted to be. The revelation that cut deepest was about intimacy, or rather its absence. Catherine described how she and William had become strangers sharing a house, how they maintained separate bedrooms and increasingly separate lives. The warmth and passion that had characterized their early years together had evaporated, replaced by a marriage that existed primarily on paper and in public appearances. They were co-parents to their children and co-performers in the royal pageant, but they were no longer lovers or confidants or true partners in any meaningful sense. Sophie listened in growing horror as Catherine unspooled years of suppressed pain and loneliness. The princess spoke about lying awake at night wondering how her life had arrived at this point, about watching other couples display genuine affection, and feeling a grief so profound she sometimes struggled to breathe. She talked about the children, about how desperately she tried to shield them from the emotional emptiness of their parents' relationship, while modeling what she hoped would be healthier patterns for their own future marriages. What made Catherine's revelations particularly devastating was not anger or bitterness, but a kind of resigned sadness, an acceptance that she had made choices that led her to this point, and that escape was impossible. She was trapped by duty and by genuine love for her children, and by a sense of responsibility to the institution she had served for 2 decades. But the cost of that entrapment was her own happiness, her own sense of self, her own right to a marriage that offered more than just shared obligation and public performance. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, Catherine's words sometimes tumbling out in desperate rushes, and sometimes emerging slowly as if she had to force them past barriers of shame and fear. Sophie said almost nothing, understanding instinctively that what Catherine needed was not advice or reassurance but simply witness, someone who would hear her truth without judgment or attempts to minimize the pain she was experiencing. When Catherine finally fell silent, exhausted by the emotional weight of everything she had revealed, Sophie made a decision that would prove catastrophic for palace communications. She reached for her phone and began typing notes, documenting key phrases and revelations, creating a record of what the princess had disclosed. Her intention was protective, a way to ensure Catherine's truth was preserved in case the princess later tried to minimize or retract what she had said. But that documentation would become the source of the crisis now engulfing Kensington Palace. Within 3 hours of that conversation, Sophie's notes had been seen by her sister, who worked in media relations for a major London public relations firm. The sister, recognizing the explosive nature of Catherine's revelations, shared them with a trusted colleague. That colleague, understanding that this information would eventually become public and wanting to position themselves advantageously, began making carefully worded inquiries to royal correspondents about potential interest in significant developments regarding the Wales marriage. By early evening, whispers had reached senior palace officials that something serious was unfolding. Emergency calls were made, security protocols reviewed, communication strategies hastily developed. The realization that Catherine had spoken candidly about her marriage and that her words had escaped the controlled environment of her private study sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. This was not a crisis that could be managed through standard procedures or deflected through carefully worded statements. William's reaction. William was attending a charitable engagement when his private secretary reached him with urgent news that required immediate private conversation. He excused himself from the event, found a secure room, and listened with growing disbelief as he was briefed on what Catherine had apparently disclosed, and on how quickly that information was spreading through networks of palace staff and media contacts. His initial reaction was denial. Catherine would never speak about their marriage to anyone, never violate the fundamental privacy that royal life required. There must be misunderstanding or exaggeration, rumors without foundation. But as his secretary provided more details, including specific phrases that sounded unmistakably like Catherine's voice and perspective, denial gave way to shock and then to anger. How could she betray their family like this? How could she expose their private struggles to people who would inevitably leak or exploit that information? Did she not understand the damage this could cause, not just to him personally but to the monarchy itself and to their children's future? William's fury was immediate and intense, decades of training in emotional control momentarily abandoned as he processed the implications of what his wife had done. But beneath the anger was something more complicated and painful. The recognition that Catherine's revelations, however damaging, were not fundamentally untrue. Their marriage had become what she described. He had become distant and controlling. They were co-parents and co-performers, but not true partners. William had told himself that this was simply what royal marriage required, that duty and responsibility necessarily constrained personal desires and intimacy. But hearing his wife's pain described so starkly forced him to confront costs he had been determinedly ignoring. William cancelled the remainder of his day's engagements and returned immediately to Adelaide Cottage, his mind racing through possible responses and damage control strategies. He needed to speak with Catherine directly, needed to understand exactly what she had said and to whom, needed to begin managing a crisis that threatened to explode beyond any possibility of containment. He found Catherine in her study, still sitting where Sophie had left her hours earlier, looking small and fragile in a way that momentarily disrupted his anger. But when he began demanding explanations, his tone harsh with barely controlled fury, Catherine's own composure hardened into something he had rarely seen from her. Defiance. "You want to know what I said?" Catherine replied, her voice quiet but steady. "I told the truth. I told someone how lonely I am, how empty our marriage has become, how I've spent years pretending to be happy while dying inside. And you know what? I'm not sorry. I'm tired of performing, tired of protecting everyone else's feelings, while my own are completely ignored." The argument that followed was brutal and revealing, years of suppressed resentments and unspoken grievances finally erupting into open conflict. William accused Catherine of selfishness and disloyalty, of putting her own needs above family and duty. Catherine countered that she had sacrificed everything for this family and institution, that she had earned the right to honest expression of her pain, even if that expression was inconvenient or uncomfortable. They fought about intimacy and distance, about decisions made unilaterally without consultation, about how William had gradually transformed from partner to authority figure. They fought about public versus private selves, about whether Catherine was obligated to maintain perfect discretion even when suffering. They fought about the children and what kind of marriage was being modeled for them, whether duty and obligation were sufficient foundation for family life. At some point during the confrontation, William's anger collapsed into something closer to despair. He sat heavily in a chair, his face in his hands, and admitted what he had never quite allowed himself to fully acknowledge. Their marriage was broken, had been breaking for years, and he did not know how to fix it or whether fixing it was even possible given the constraints and demands of their positions. Catherine, seeing her husband's defenses finally lowered, felt her own anger soften into sadness. She sat beside him and they talked with more honesty than they had managed in years, acknowledging failures and hurts on both sides, recognizing that they had both contributed to the distance between them even if palace life and royal duty had created the environment where that distance could grow unchecked. But their personal reckoning was interrupted by William's private secretary, calling with news that made their marital crisis suddenly seem far more urgent and dangerous. Multiple media outlets had been contacted by sources offering information about Catherine's revelations. The palace had hours at most before this story broke publicly, before Catherine's private pain became international headlines and their marriage became subject of global speculation and judgment. Palace in crisis. Kensington Palace descended into controlled chaos as senior staff worked frantically to assess the damage and develop response strategies. Sir Edward Hamilton convened emergency meetings, pulling in communications experts, legal advisors, and senior members of William's household to coordinate what would be the most sensitive crisis management of his career. The challenge was unprecedented. This was not a scandal involving infidelity or financial impropriety, areas where the palace had established protocols and response frameworks. This was the future queen consort publicly expressing profound unhappiness in her marriage to the future king. There was no playbook for managing revelations that struck at the heart of the Wales family's public image, while being fundamentally about private emotional realities rather than concrete actions or events. The communications team debated whether to issue an immediate denial, to characterize Catherine's words as taken out of context or misrepresented. But several factors argued against simple denial. First, there were multiple witnesses to Catherine's conversation with Sophie, and attempting to lie about what was said would only create additional problems when the truth inevitably emerged. Second, Denying Catherine's feelings would make the palace appear callous and would likely generate sympathy for the princess rather than protecting the institution. Legal advisors explored whether there were grounds to prevent publication through injunctions or privacy claims. But British privacy law offered limited protection for information voluntarily disclosed to third parties, even if that disclosure was made in confidence. Catherine's words to Sophie, once shared beyond that immediate conversation, had lost much of their legal protection. Attempts to suppress publication might succeed temporarily, but would almost certainly fail ultimately, while drawing even more attention to the story. The question became not whether Catherine's revelations would become public, but how to manage the narrative when they did. The palace needed to get ahead of the story, to frame it in ways that minimized damage while acknowledging enough truth to maintain credibility. They needed to protect the monarchy as institution while showing compassion for Catherine as individual. They needed to preserve William's reputation and future kingship while not appearing to dismiss or minimize his wife's genuine suffering. Different factions within the palace advocated different approaches. Some argued for a joint statement from William and Catherine, acknowledging marital difficulties while emphasizing their commitment to working through challenges together and protecting their children. Others preferred separate statements that would allow each to speak in their own voice while maintaining unified front on key points. Still others wanted minimal official response, allowing the story to break and then managing reaction rather than preemptively confirming details that might otherwise remain speculative. The media relations team analyzed potential coverage scenarios, wargaming how different outlets would frame the story and what narratives would dominate initial reporting. British tabloids would almost certainly sensationalize with headlines about royal marriage collapse and speculation about divorce. Broadsheet newspapers would take more measured approaches, but would still give the story prominent placement and extensive analysis. International media would frame it through their own cultural lenses, some sympathetic to Catherine, and others critical of her breach of royal protocol. Social media presented its own unique challenges. The story would trend globally within hours of breaking, with millions of people offering opinions and judgments based on incomplete information and personal biases. The palace could not control social media narratives, but needed strategies for monitoring and potentially responding to the most damaging or inaccurate claims. They needed to identify influential voices who might be enlisted to provide more balanced perspectives and to counter the most extreme speculation. Meanwhile, efforts were underway to identify and contain the sources leaking information. Sophie Alderton was immediately called in for emergency meeting with senior household staff, where she was confronted with the catastrophic breach of trust her documentation and sharing of Catherine's words represented. Sophie, realizing the magnitude of what she had set in motion, broke down completely, apologizing profusely while insisting her intentions had been protective rather than malicious. But intentions mattered little when measured against consequences. Sophie's actions had created a crisis that could damage the monarchy's credibility, harm Catherine's relationship with William, and subject the Wales children to public scrutiny of their parents' marriage. There would be consequences for Sophie professionally and legally, but those consequences would have to wait until the immediate crisis was addressed. Her immediate termination was discussed but ultimately deferred, with advisors recognizing that firing her in the midst of the crisis might appear vindictive and could turn her into a sympathetic figure willing to share even more information with the media. The palace legal team explored Sophie's potential liability under employment contracts and confidentiality agreements she had signed upon joining Catherine's household. Civil remedies might be available, but pursuing them would require public legal proceedings that would keep the story alive and provide additional fodder for media coverage. Criminal charges seemed unlikely given the nature of the breach, but the legal review continued as the evening progressed. Catherine herself was brought into emergency planning sessions, her input sought on how to handle revelations that she had initiated even if she had not intended their public disclosure. She was torn between a defensive instinct to protect her privacy and recognition that her words, once spoken, could not be unsaid, and that attempting to completely suppress them would likely fail while making everything worse. She proposed something that initially horrified palace communications staff, but that gained support as they considered alternatives. What if she owned her truth publicly? What if, instead of denying or minimizing, Catherine gave a carefully controlled interview acknowledging marital difficulties while framing them as challenges that many couples face and that she and William were committed to addressing? The approach was risky, but potentially offered better outcome than defensive denial or forced silence. The controlled interview strategy had precedence in corporate crisis management, but was virtually unprecedented for senior royals discussing personal relationships. Princess Diana's famous Panorama interview stood as cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled disclosure, but that interview had been conducted without palace knowledge or approval and had been designed deliberately to damage rather than to manage crisis. Catherine's proposed approach would be different, carefully scripted and coordinated with palace communications, while still allowing her authentic voice and acknowledgement of genuine struggles. William was initially resistant to any approach that involved public acknowledgement of private struggles. His instinct was to protect privacy above all, to refuse to give credibility to speculation by confirming any details. But his advisors explained that silence would not stop the story, would not prevent Catherine's words from becoming public, and might actually make everything worse by creating information vacuum that speculation and rumor would eagerly fill. The debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on all sides and growing recognition that perfect solutions did not exist. Every option carried significant risks. Every strategy would displease some constituency and potentially backfire in unpredictable ways. The palace was attempting to manage a crisis unprecedented in modern royal history, navigating between transparency and discretion, between protecting privacy and maintaining credibility. As Saturday evening deepened into night, the palace faced impossible choices with no clear right answer. Every option carried significant risks and potential for backfire. Every strategy had passionate advocates and equally passionate critics among senior staff. The clock was ticking toward publication of stories that would transform Catherine's private confession into global news, and no amount of careful planning could fully control or predict how public reaction would unfold. The children. Amidst all the crisis management and strategic planning, one consideration dominated William and Catherine's private discussions: how to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from the storm about to engulf their family. The children were old enough to understand that something was wrong, young enough that they could not fully process the complexities of adult relationships and public scrutiny. George, at 11, was most vulnerable to understanding media coverage and peer conversations. He would hear about his parents' marital troubles at school, would face questions from classmates and speculation from people who thought themselves entitled to opinions about his family's private life. William and Catherine needed to speak with him before he learned about the situation through external sources, needed to provide context and reassurance, even while acknowledging difficult realities. The conversation with George took place in his bedroom, both parents sitting on his bed while their eldest son listened with the careful attention he had learned was required when discussing serious matters. William and Catherine explained, in age-appropriate language, that they had been facing challenges in their marriage, that relationships sometimes went through difficult periods, that none of this was George's fault or responsibility. George asked questions that broke both parents' hearts. Were they getting divorced? Did they still love each other? Was the family going to fall apart? William and Catherine answered as honestly as they could while offering reassurances that might or might not prove accurate. They were not getting divorced. They did still love each other, even if that love was complicated and strained. The family would stay together, and the children would always be the most important priority for both parents. Charlotte and Louis received simpler explanations calibrated to their ages and understanding. Charlotte was told that Mummy and Daddy were working through some grown-up problems and that she might hear people talking about their family, but that she should know her parents loved her very much and that everything would be okay. Louis was simply told that families sometimes face challenges, but that what mattered most was that they stayed together and supported each other. The children's reactions varied. George retreated into careful composure, asking no follow-up questions and showing no obvious emotion, internalizing everything in ways that worried both parents, but that they did not know how to address in the moment. Charlotte cried and wanted reassurance through physical affection, climbing into Catherine's lap and holding on tightly while her mother whispered promises that might not be entirely within her power to keep. Louis seemed not to fully understand the significance of what he was being told, accepting his parents' words without apparent distress and quickly returning attention to his toys. After speaking with the children, William and Catherine sat together in silence, both recognizing that whatever happened next with media coverage and public reaction, this moment represented a fundamental shift in their family's life. Their children would grow up knowing their parents' marriage was troubled, that the fairy tale image presented to the world was not complete truth, that private struggles existed beneath public performance. The breaking story. At 9:43 on Saturday night, the first story broke online through a royal correspondent, known for reliable sources and careful reporting. The headline was restrained compared to what would follow. Sources indicate Wales marriage under strain. The article quoted anonymous palace sources describing Catherine's recent emotional state and suggesting that she had confided in staff about serious marital difficulties. Within minutes, other outlets began publishing their own versions, each adding details and quotes from sources positioned at varying distances from actual knowledge. Social media exploded with reaction ranging from shock to sympathy to criticism. Hashtags began trending globally as millions of people who followed the royals with varying degrees of interest suddenly focused intense attention on William and Catherine's marriage. The palace had prepared a statement for release as soon as the story broke, carefully worded to acknowledge difficulties while emphasizing the couple's commitment to their family and their roles. The Prince and Princess of Wales have faced challenges in their marriage, as many couples do. They are working together to address these challenges while prioritizing the well-being of their children and their service to the nation. They request privacy and understanding during this difficult time. The statement was simultaneously too much and not enough. It confirmed that problems existed while providing no details about their nature or severity. It invited sympathy while maintaining distance. It attempted to normalize royal marital difficulties while acknowledging that such difficulties existed at all, which represented significant departure from typical palace approach of revealing nothing about private relationships. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Many people expressed sympathy for Catherine, relating to her description of loneliness and emotional absence in marriage. Others criticized her for breaking royal protocol and exposing private matters that should have remained private. Some questioned William's fitness for kingship if he could not maintain his own marriage. Others argued that marital troubles were private matters that should not affect professional capabilities or public service. Media coverage ranged from thoughtful analysis of pressures on royal marriages to tabloid speculation about affairs and potential divorce. Royal correspondents who had covered William and Catherine for years suddenly re-examined past appearances and interactions through new lens, finding evidence of distance and strain in moments they had previously interpreted as normal royal reserve. Catherine's family released their own statement expressing support for their daughter and asking media to respect her privacy and dignity. The Middletons had always maintained careful distance from royal drama, but this situation pulled them into public comment despite their preferences for discretion. Senior royals faced difficult decisions about their own responses. King Charles was briefed on the situation and reportedly was deeply troubled by both the marital crisis itself and its public exposure. Camilla offered private support to Catherine while maintaining public silence. Princess Anne, characteristically direct, reportedly told William that he needed to fix his marriage or accept consequences of its failure, that self-pity served no one's interests. The reckoning is. Sunday morning dawns, William and Catherine face a future profoundly changed from the one they woke to yesterday. Their private struggles are now public knowledge, their marriage subject to global commentary and speculation, their children exposed to scrutiny neither parent ever wanted them to experience. They sit together in the early morning quiet before the children wake, talking with an honesty and vulnerability that has been absent from their relationship for too long. The crisis, devastating as it is, has forced conversations they should have had years ago, acknowledgement of problems they had been avoiding, recognition that something fundamental needs to change if their marriage is to survive and their family to thrive. William apologizes for his distance and control, for treating Catherine as subordinate rather than partner, for allowing duty to crowd out intimacy and connection. Catherine acknowledges her own failures to communicate clearly, to demand attention to her needs rather than suffering in silence, to insist on relationship maintenance even when palace life made such maintenance difficult. They talk about what comes next, about how to rebuild trust and connection while managing public fallout from revelations neither wanted to make but that cannot now be taken back. They discuss therapy, both individual and couples counseling to address patterns and wounds that will not heal without professional help. They commit to prioritizing their relationship, to protecting time for each other away from duties and children and constant demands of royal life. The path forward will not be easy. Public exposure of marital difficulties creates pressures and complications that will take months or years to fully navigate. The children will need support processing their parents' struggles and the public attention those struggles generate. The palace will need to manage ongoing media interest while protecting family privacy to whatever extent remains possible. But alongside the challenges is also possibility. Catherine's confession, however unintended its public disclosure, has created space for authenticity that royal life rarely permits. The acknowledgement of marital struggles, rather than destroying the Wales family image, might ultimately humanize them in ways that strengthen rather than weaken public connection. People relate to relationship difficulties, understand the work required to maintain marriages, respect couples who face challenges with honesty rather than pretense. The sun rises over Kensington Palace on Sunday morning, illuminating a family forever changed by revelations that were never meant to leave a private study, but that now define their public existence. William and Catherine sit together in fragile truce, knowing that their marriage is broken but perhaps not beyond repair, that their children are watching and learning what it means to fight for relationships worth saving, even when fighting is painful and uncertain. And across Britain, millions who read those devastating headlines are now watching to see whether the future king and queen can rebuild what confession has shattered, or whether Catherine's truth has already destroyed the fairy tale beyond any possibility of resurrection.